Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of Lunch and Learn with Geo. Today, we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies. Um, just to be clear, Bitcoin is only one of cryptocurrencies. It's not the generic term for all cryptocurrencies. So we're going to learn a lot about it and of what lawyers need to know about it. I am recording this, so be careful what you say, and I'll try to be careful about what I say, although I never am. Housekeeping items, please use the Zoom chat box if you want to ask any questions. Please mute yourselves, and we'll give you instructions about getting CLE credit at the end of the session. Just as a reminder, we are here because the rule of our profession requires us to maintain some competency, and its particular competency when it comes to relevant technology, and this is certainly a relevant technology. Our speaker today is Nelson Rosario. Nelson and I have worked together in the past. Um, he's a former, or I don't know, are you still teaching at Kent?
I am not. I decided to
Okay,
take that off my plate last year.
well, all right. Uh, so uh, he knows what he's talking about. How about that? Um, and I'm going to stop sharing, Nelson, and invite you to share.
Okay, sounds good. Let me just close out all of my extremely embarrassing content in the background here.
Darn.
It's just really nerdy tech stuff. Don't worry. Okay.
Oh, good. Oh,
Uh,
you're programming these days?
I wish I had time to program. Okay. All right. Let's see. Can you see my slide deck?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I will just get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Nelson Rosario. I'm the founder of Rosario Tech Law. It's great to be here to talk to you today about blockchain and cryptocurrency. I hope that you can hear me well enough. I'm happy to share slides after the talk. This is truly meant to be very informal. Um, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about this technology and the legal issues related to it. But my hope today is that we can kind of orient you properly so that as your existing clients or potential clients come to you with issues that may be related to digital assets, cryptocurrency, smart contracts, DAOs, blockchain, distributed ledgers, whatever buzzword they may use, which really aren't buzzwords anymore, that you'll feel more confident in your ability to deal with the issues, and really that a lot of this stuff is not actually new, even if the technology itself is new. So, you know, I'm going to give you a lot of background material because I think it's important. We're going to talk about Bitcoin because all of this does trace back to Bitcoin. Then we'll talk a little bit about use cases and then some of the legal stuff at play. So, who am I? Well, as George said, and as I said, I'm the founder of Rosario Tech Law. We're a boutique firm based here in Chicago that services clients globally in the emerging tech
You're
space.
hey, Nelson,
Yeah.
you've got you're not showing your
Oh, it's not popping up.
no, it's I could see it, but I could see that it's not the show. There,
Oh,
no,
interesting.
you don't have it in start your slideshow.
How about now?
We've got the small screens on the side, if that's what you want.
Small screens on the side.
You've
Interesting.
got your entire outline on the side. Is that what you want?
No, that's not what I want at all. All right, hold on.
Then start the top left hand. No, you go back to share.
Okay.
You've
I
done
think
this
I know what I
before, I
want to do.
think, right?
Never with three screens. I moved offices and now I've got a different screen set up. All right, how
There
about
you
this?
go. Now we
You
got
see
it.
just this? Okay,
Yeah,
just this screen? Okay.
there we go. We missed your
All right.
intro. There you go.
There was nothing important there. Um, Right. So, anyways, most of my day to day is working with clients in emerging tech, whether it's in the cryptocurrency blockchain space or the AI space. I also do a fair amount of public policy work. I'm one of the founders of the Illinois Blockchain Association. At present, we're actually dealing with the IDFPR on rulemaking for the Digital Asset Consumer Protection Act, which I'll talk briefly about later on. And as George mentioned, I was a adjunct law professor for 7 years, where we actually created one of the country's first law school classes on blockchain, cryptocurrency, and the law. So, what is blockchain? Is it the future? Is it a scam? The magic internet money? Um,
All of the above?
all of the above. It depends, right? But fundamentally, what this technology is about and why we as lawyers should care and why society kind of just in general should care also is that this is really about trust because blockchain reframes how people coordinate trust across networks. Um, Another way to think about that is that really what we're talking about here is a new kind of coordination technology. Um, Back when I taught the law school class, an entire lecture on an economic history of the world. And when you look back at kind of world history and networks and everything, every time there have been breakthroughs in coordination technologies, whether it was the telegram, the printing press, you know, telephones, the internet, etc., there have typically been corresponding economic booms that transform the way that human beings coordinate their activity, not just economic, just any activity, right? And that's kind of always been my thesis of why this is really important, even if it's not always clear on the surface why it's important, right? Um, because what these technologies enable is trust without a central counterparty, right? So as lawyers, we're often the central counterparty to transactions, right? We kind of sit in the middle. And that's how human beings have always typically managed trust, right? There's an intermediary in between two parties to a transaction. They reconcile the records, um, and they're the people that you go to with disputes or to get clarification on what is what, right? But with blockchain, cryptocurrency, and smart contracts, to this concept of network trust, right? Where there's a public rule set for how information is exchanged on a network, and then you trust, people like to say in the industry, you trust the math. There's cryptographic verification of transactions on these networks. So that's this idea of network trust. Um, Thinking about it here more kind of visually, right? Traditionally, we've used banks, right? We still use banks. And in fact, most of my crypto clients, I have them pay me via my Chase Bank account. Now, there are some clients I have where, they pay me in stable coins, which a stable coin is a type of cryptocurrency, which is supposed to hold its value pegged to something else. I get paid in USDC, which you might be able to guess is a cryptocurrency that's pegged to the value of the US dollar. So it's one USDC is worth one US dollar, right? Um, but traditionally, it's ACH transfers to your bank, it's wire transfers to the bank. You know who to complain. I'm down here in the loop on Daily Plaza. I can go to Chase Tower and I can go yell at a private banker if I'm not getting the wires I'm supposed to be getting, whatever, right? But we've moved to this digital world as the internet has permeated our very existence in every single way, whether we want it to or not, to having the option of this network trust. So on the right, you can see there's this image of the world map, and it's kind of like a heat map because each little dot on here is a node in the Bitcoin network. Now, this is an old map, but it still kind of tracks to where the activity of the network exists out in the world. And so each one of those nodes corresponds to a computer that is participating in the network and securing it and abiding by those public rules and allowing people to exchange value at a distance without the use of that counterparty, right? And so they do that through the use of ledgers. I mean, this is how human beings have tracked things forever, right? But they use it through distributed ledgers. And the distributed ledger is really um, what if instead of that counterparty in the middle having the main ledger, everybody that takes part in the network could have their own copy of the ledger, right? So it's a shared. Many participants keep a copy of this. Uh, the You need to kind of make sure in any ledger that the transactions are sequenced, that they're ordered appropriately, and you also want it auditable, right? The history of the ledger should be difficult to rewrite. Okay, and think about property transactions. That's a ledger of sorts. You go to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, you're you're dealing with a ledger. It's not a distributed ledger, right? The government is maintaining that ledger itself, but it's a transactional ledger that grows and grows over time with who owns what property. You can go back and look at it. And in a certain sense, you could think of it conceptually as kind of a blockchain. Um, Here's just another way to kind of visualize, what is underpinning this technology, right? It's all these nodes, so you can kind of see node A, node B, node C, node D. Those correspond to each of those little dots in our world map here, right? Because each of those dots could carry their own copy of the ledger, right? And they all talk to each other. And when transactions occur, they check against their copy of the ledger. Hey, is this transaction valid, right? There's a rule set that they can uh, make kind of a checklist that they go through to make sure that a transaction is valid and it is in line with their history. So really a blockchain, which enables cryptocurrency and smart contracts and all this other stuff, uh, is a combination of blocks of data that are linked together through cryptography. Um,
There's
one of
that
the
word
di-
again. There's that word again, data.
One of the, in my experience, one of the kind of problems in talking about this space is that sometimes people can get tripped up on the use of what they think are technical terms, which because they are, but it's not magic. I mean, this stuff is stuff that anybody can learn. I mean, after teaching law school class for 7 years to students that come from all walks of life, very few who had technical backgrounds, after giving dozens of CLEs on this and other emerging tech concepts, I'm convinced that anybody can learn any of this stuff, right? You just have to break it down into its component parts and kind of look at it from first principles, which is kind of why I'm going through all of this background to kind of lay the foundation. So, what's important here in these blockchain systems, distributed ledger systems, is that the history of transactions is append only, meaning that the new entries are built upon prior entries in the ledger itself. Okay. Um, Here's another visualization of this, and this is kind of important because it highlights one of these key building blocks is this idea of hashes. You can think of a hash as a fingerprint for a particular piece of data, right? So it's a mathematical equation. You send in the data and out comes a fingerprint that if you change the data at all, you send it through the formula, you'll get a different fingerprint. So it's a way that you can get assurance that nobody has tampered with the data because it would be evident that the data had been tampered with. So in this visualization, we have block one, which has a particular hash. Here it's 6U9P2. And that what that hash means is that's the fingerprint that corresponds with the data that's stored in this block. So when you want to add a new block to a blockchain, make sure all the transactions are valid, you put them into the block, but then you create a fingerprint for it. So this block two has a different fingerprint. It's got 8Y5C9, but it also has pointer to the previous block in the chain, right? And that's the previous hash. There it is. There's that first fingerprint, 6U9P2. That's how you know that it's pointing to the previous ones. There's certain properties when you build out this system, this kind of fingerprint, public transactions, etc., that if you then try and make changes, if you get to block 3, and then you try and make changes to block 1 later on, you would then have to make changes to block 2 and block 3 because within block 2 is the previous hash for block 1. So you, like I said, the hash is a way to create a fingerprint. So if any of the data on the input side gets changed at all, you get a different fingerprint. So if you're out here and the time is block 3, and now you're someone, a malicious attacker is trying to change a transaction in block 1 will have a different hash from this 6U9P2, which means block 2 will have a different hash because its previous hash will no longer be the correct one. And similarly, block 3. So it makes it extremely difficult to go back and change old transaction data to these networks, which is why it's part of the security model and why people trust them. This is a really important point. I know it's a very technical point, but it's why kind of mathematically you can work out once you get to about 6 blocks deep, it's almost, you basically have to take over an entire network to go back and change old transaction data. And those blocks, at least on the Bitcoin network, are added to the network once about every 10 minutes or so. So after an hour of a transaction being added to the blockchain, there's basically no way to go back and change it. And it all begins with Bitcoin. So, really with our digital existence, we know files are easy to copy, right? So any information on your computer, Control C, Control V, that's it, right? You're just copying and pasting. I mean, that's the practice of law today, isn't it? Maybe just me. Um, but there's another property if you're trying to create something that's currency, right? You don't want the money to be spent twice. So if you're in an environment where something is really easy to replicate, but you don't want people replicating things of value, have what's known as the double spend problem. And that was the impetus for creating Bitcoin. So this is just a screen grab from the
There's that
Bitcoin.
paper.
Yeah, there it is, the Bitcoin white paper, which was released on October 31st, 2008. There's a link in the deck to the actual PDF. I really recommend you read it. It's only 9 pages. A friend of mine who is a lawyer out in New York, who I guess we've known each other for about a decade now and both been practicing in this space for about a decade. He said, and I wish I would have thought of this because I think it's genius, but he said anytime, he used to tell people anytime that they got interested in this, he would say, just go to the Bitcoin white paper. It's 9 pages and read it. And every time you encounter a word or a concept don't understand, look it up. And by the end of it, you will understand all of this. And I think he's exactly right. So, the white paper, it's very short. I recommend you read it. It covers all of the technical concepts really that are necessary. It gives you an extremely strong foundation to understand everything going on in this industry. But what Bitcoin came up with was a combination of kind of 4 parts to create, people had been poking around trying to figure out how do we create internet money, right? How do we, without the use of a bank? It was born out of kind of a quasi-political anarchist kind of viewpoint of the world called the cypherpunks. And Bitcoin realized, whoever wrote the white paper, the network launched January 3rd, 2009. So not long after the white paper was published, October 31st, 2008. And the authors realized, there's some debate around that, which I suppose is interesting to some people. But if you use the idea of ledgers and you made them public so that all the transactions on the network were visible for verification, if you use cryptography, which is kind of those fingerprinting concepts that I talked about, public-private key pairs, which are how a lot of the information that we exchange on the internet is verified anyway, use digital signatures, use hashing, You had a consensus algorithm, which is a way that participants in the network can come together to agree on what is true and correct. And then you pair in some economic incentives to reward people to actually spend the computing power to secure the network. You can end up with verification without a central counterparty. And so the result is you have, for the first time, this idea of digital scarcity, which translates, in my opinion, to unique digital property. It simply did not exist because the way that we had always handled data and the transfer of information on the internet prior to Bitcoin was the use of central counterparties. And so if Chase said I had X amount of money in my business's account, I'm relying upon Chase. Now, Chase can, for whatever their own internal reasons, shut down my account. Then who do I have to go complain with? Well, I got to go down Chase Tower, like I said earlier, right? But if my money is associated with a particular address on the Bitcoin network and it's secured by the power of the network, unless you can take over the network itself, you know, that's where it lives. And you don't need that central record keeper. So a lot of interesting things happen when you take these building blocks of, a network, a distributed network around the world, public ledgers, known cryptography, and the economic incentives, which I won't go into here, although it's a very interesting part. There's essentially two ways that these networks that cryptocurrencies live on kind of incentivize people to spend the resources to secure networks. One is something called proof of work, which you may have heard of Bitcoin mining. That's the most famous example, where if you successfully validate the information that comprises a block that's added to the blockchain, you can reward yourself some Bitcoin as part of that for expending the effort. Proof of stake is the other main alternative, or is the main alternative to proof of work, and that involves kind of basically ponying up a certain amount of money in the currency to as part of the validation and adding blocks to the network. And if your block gets added, you get a reward for staking that amount of money. The economic incentives can get pretty complex quickly, and they're not terribly important for this particular presentation.
Hey, Nelson, when
Yeah.
when the blockchain, let's use Bitcoin as an example, is created initially, it whoever created it initially created some value with no consideration. So, for example, if I want to buy Bitcoin now, I have to put cash into something and I get a Bitcoin. But when it's initially set up, did the initial founders of Bitcoin not put any money in and just made money out of the ground, out of the air?
The short answer is yes.
So
So,
if I want to start my own cryptocurrency exchange,
hmm
cryptocurrency, George's crypto,
hmm
and everybody thinks it's cool, I could make money by having other people buy into it then, right?
you certainly could.
Well, I want to be Trump for a day then.
I used to think that I understood money fairly well until I really fell down the rabbit hole with all of this in 2014. And now money is really whatever human beings agree it to be, right? I mean, there's a lot of legal apparatus built around what money is in the United States and other countries. But I mean, fundamentally, human beings have been using all sorts of stuff for money. Maybe the most interesting thing, if you care about this stuff in the history, is to look up the islands of Yap and what they use for money on Yap, which are just giant stones that have information etched into them, and the stones never move. In fact, people trust the Yap stones so much that one time one of the stones being transported between islands sunk on the ship that it was being transported to the bottom of the ocean. And people still honored who owned what according to the stone. So there's also a really interesting case study in the banks being shut down in Ireland in the 70s because of strikes, and people just created IOUs with the pubs being the clearinghouses for the IOUs, and it was so effective that the Irish economy even grew during the periods that the banks were struck down, much to the chagrin of economists who said everything would go to hell.
And I
So
and so instead of cryptocurrency, maybe I could trade in baseball cards, right?
you could, well, right now I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and the FIFA Panini stickers that for the World Cup are like the hottest commodity in the world. There was a whole, I think like a CBS Sunday Morning bit on how at this moment stickers are worth more than their weight in gold. Um,
Well, I wasn't joking about this because the point of a baseball card transaction is it's only valuable if somebody else wants it.
yeah,
And so with cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, it's only valuable if somebody else wants it and somebody's willing to give you something in return for it,
yeah.
which is why the price varies so much in Bitcoin. It's like a baseball card. It's just traded for whatever value is current right now.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why cryptocurrency has had such difficulty integrating into the traditional financial system because we have this entire legal apparatus built around everything settling in US dollars, which are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. I would argue they're also backed by what is it, the 14 different carrier strike groups that we have of the US Navy, and a couple other things. But uh, when you really get down to kind of why do any of these cryptocurrencies have value, it's exactly what you're saying, George. Because people think they have value, right? And that creates, you know, concern because in part of, the network, here, centralized versus decentralized, on the left, centralized network, that could be the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, right? They handle trillions in dollars of volume. On the right, that's literally just random people on the internet that you'll never meet, right? That you don't even, the beauty of the system is that you don't have to trust the people on the right because everybody is playing by the same public rules. And as I mentioned, when you're trying to validate transactions, there's a particular checklist that you use to make sure that it's valid. And if any transaction you try and include in a block that gets added to a blockchain or wants to be added to a blockchain, it won't get added because it's not a valid transaction. So, the systems on the right are really engineered to be, sometimes people say, trustless. You're actually trusting the rules of the game, so to speak. But they are engineered such that you don't have to trust the human beings that are involved. You just trust the
You know,
rules.
can the same theory, the blockchain theory of verification, can that be used for other things? How about deeds? Why do we need a recorder of deeds office? Why don't we set up a decentralized network of registering deeds rather than going to the recorder's office?
You could, and actually in Cook County, they ran a pilot back in 2016 where they spec'd out replacing chain of title through the deeds, the recorder, and they realized kind of what I'd call the grandma problem, where grandma can't lose access to her private key because her private key is kind of the access to the information that's on the network, right? So if you lose access to your private keys, these systems are unforgiving. You functionally cannot then exert control over the asset on the network.
And
But you can.
I heard that that's a pretty common problem where people lose their key and they're never able to recover whatever
Yeah.
they had in the blockchain.
Yeah, I lost all of my keys in a boating accident, so no, I'm joking. But that's a common joke that no, I don't have any cryptocurrency. It's I lost it all at the bottom of the lake. Um, but yeah, so you can use this for other stuff, and I'll get to that soon. But so, just touching briefly on kind of these four parts again. cryptography is really, we were just talking about keys because keys are how you control and access things on the network. Hashes are those fingerprints that make it evident when somebody's tampered with data. And then signatures are just like digital signatures that you use in other capacities. They prove a particular party authorized a transaction. Um, and that point, if you lose a private key, it can mean that you lose practical control of something. Blockchains are typically two different kinds of flavors. They're permissionless or they're permissioned. Personally, I think the permissionless stuff is far more interesting because there's a lot harder legal questions associated with that. Permissionless is, it's much more enterprise friendly. It's good for different use cases. Or, permission just means basically you know, every participant in the network has to go through some sort of verification process before they can play uh, in the garden. Uh, and here's some examples of kind of what you can do with all these things. If you have unique digital properties, you have this verification system for exchanging information on a network where you don't trust the other participants. What are the things that you can do? Well, one of the things we've talked about is stable coins, payments, right? So a stable coin is a type of cryptocurrency whose value is pegged to something else. The most reliable stable coins are pegged to the United States dollar. A couple examples of that is USDC, which is made by a company called Circle, which Circle had an IPO last year. The president of Circle actually is a Chicago-based lawyer. Um, and another example of stablecoins would be World Liberty Financial's stablecoin product. Um, Remittances is actually a really good use case for cryptocurrency because these networks run 24/7, 365, right? You don't need to go through Western Union, you don't need to go through a bank. Also, you can move if you're willing to wait for the transaction to get added to a block. um, you can move a tremendous amount of money for almost no fees. You can pay a fee in these networks to try and move things quicker because people that collect transactions and add them to blocks, if they see you added, let's say you want to move $1 million and you add a $10,000 fee to move the $1 million, somebody's going to gobble that up because they can collect that fee and try and add it to a block quickly. But you could move $1 million without assigning any fee to it if you're willing to wait for it to be included. There's you know, custodying those keys and wallets is another area. Create a chain of custody for evidence purposes. We talked about land deeds for records, for property and provenance. You can engage in all sorts of kind of interesting financial transactions in an automated way through the use of smart contracts. But then getting kind of out there, you can engage in different governance on the corporate side of things, or just trying to manage an organization in a digitally native fashion through things called DAOs. Um, I've said a lot. This is all kind of background material. And so what? Who cares about this? Well, turns out a lot of people care. Here's the one of the executive orders related to crypto from the current administration, strengthening American leadership in digital financial technology. This was issued January 23rd, 2025. If you had told me, I gave my first talk on public talk on Bitcoin in the fall of 2015 at a conference for entrepreneurs. And if you had told me that at some point the White House would be talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, I would have thought you were completely crazy. There's just no way that that's going to happen. But here we are. This is just a Copilot search on the other image of the size of the cryptocurrency market, 2.65 trillion, which is not that big compared to most financial markets, but it's a big market. Uh, Fidelity, how do you invest in crypto? They have a variety of products. Fidelity has been actually a participant in this industry since about 2015 or so. So really, this is not just, fake magic internet money. These are now legitimate assets through the tokens or coins. The networks are used to secure these transactions. And there's a whole industry of intermediaries, ironically, that have been built up to help people exchange, broker deals, custody their keys, custody their wallets, things like that. Really, what is cryptocurrency? This is from Investopedia. It's a digital or virtual currency secured by cryptography and based on a network that is distributed across a large number of computers. So kind of putting it all together, let's say I want to transfer money to George. So my transaction will ultimately be represented in a block, and the block is broadcast to the other participants in the network. They all go through their checklists, they approve it as valid, and then that block gets added to the blockchain. And as far as the network is concerned, and as far as George is concerned, he receives money. But that whole process involves a lot of things. George is very tech savvy. He probably has a hardware wallet at home, and so he self custodies his cryptocurrency.
Oh, absolutely.
He controls his keys. There's no help desk, but as you've probably inferred because we were talking about it, there's a high degree of responsibility with self custody, right? If George loses that hardware wallet, his Bitcoin lives on in the network, but his ability to access it is gone, right? That's why people make that joke about, oh, I lost my keys in a boating accident, because they don't want people to believe that they can actually access their cryptocurrency. Most people use custodians. This is a third party controlling and managing those keys on your behalf. I've had a Coinbase account since like 2013, 2014, because I know who I can complain to. I also self custody and do other stuff. But that's again, there's a great financial columnist for Bloomberg, Matthew Levine, who always jokes, and he's been writing about cryptocurrency and blockchain for, yeah, I don't know, 12 years or so. He was a corporate lawyer, M&A lawyer, and then he worked at Goldman Sachs, and then he became a financial journalist. And his joke is that the whole point of the blockchain industry is to relearn the financial history of the world as fast as possible. So all of this, hey, you can't just carry gold bars around, right? It's much more efficient if somebody custodies them for you and all these things and everything else. And that's what's happened with the industry, right? The most successful companies are companies like Coinbase and Kraken, who take away that responsibility or manage that responsibility for you. But as lawyers, these are fundamental questions that are no different. It's just a different set of technology. We got to ask who can move what, who should be liable, and what do the records show? You know, Smart contracts are where things get a little more interesting because if you take the idea that you have unique digital property that people can't tamper with unless it becomes evident that they've tampered with it. Well, what if you took the rights and responsibilities, remedies, um, in an agreement and you put that in computer code, kind of if this situation, then this execution happens or this condition occurs, etc. And you deployed it out on a blockchain. Could you have automated agreements? You can kind of think of it like public offers in contract law, right? Where advertisements, if you do this, or the first 10 people that do X or show up on Saturday get this discount, etc. But you've transmuted it into computer code and it's out on a network and anybody can interact with the contract. Here's just a visualization of kind of what that means. You identify the agreement, who the parties are to it. You set the conditions so that it will automatically execute when conditions are met. You code in any sort of logic, then you deploy it out to a blockchain and it just runs there. And anytime people send the necessary data, whether it's cryptocurrency or other information to a smart contract, it'll automatically execute. So lots of crazy albeit interesting things happen because of that. It's an old concept, which was originally analogized to a vending machine back in a blog post in 1994 and kind of explored further in 1996 from a guy named Nick Szabo, who's many people think Nick Szabo might be Satoshi Nakamoto. Personally, I don't think he is, but he's got some very interesting writing uh, that spans a couple decades now. Um, there's a lot of interesting characters involved in kind of all of this. How are we doing on time, George?
We're pretty good. We got about 15 minutes to go.
Okay, cool. Um, the really far out there stuff is related to DAOs, which are known as decentralized autonomous organizations. And basically, the idea is could you have kind of a quote unquote leaderless organization or an organization which is digital in nature and enabled through smart contracts um, because you trust the rules of the network that things will execute according to your expectations in advance, right? So another way to think of this is these are would be member-owned communities without centralized leadership, a safer way for people to collaborate with internet strangers, and they can commit funds to a specific cause. So the very first DAO was called very creatively the DAO, and it occurred on the Ethereum network in 2016. And basically, the idea was to try and create like a venture capital fund that was enabled via smart contracts on the Ethereum network. And it worked for a time. There was I think they funded a company that was trying to create an Uber that utilized driverless cars. Um, but then ultimately the DAO ended up being hacked, and some of the limitations of smart contracts and networks were fully exposed by that hack. And that DAO ended, led to a split in the Ethereum community, which is an interesting story in of itself. Um, but with traditional organizations, there's kind of a hierarchy. Um, they're what we know, right? They're corporations, and so how do you port that over to a network-driven approach with certain limitations, right? How do you handle things like voting? There's tons of legal work related to DAOs that get at,
Are they regulated anywhere?
yes, there's Wyoming has been very vocal in their creation of a framework called DUNAs, which is decentralized, uniform nonprofit associations. And basically, in Wyoming, they created a network or a legal regime to recognize a DAO in an analogous way to a traditional corporation, right? But it's not governed the same way. Um,
So in Wyoming, are they like registered like a corporation to transact business?
yeah, sort of.
Sorta. Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
So they have a
There's also
registered, they would have a registered agent or a
yes,
location or something?
yes, a registered agent who acts on behalf of the DAO.
Okay.
I think I've only represented a DAO once. That was
So,
years ago.
so how are DAOs being used now?
Um, well,
I want to start a DAO. What would I use it for?
what we use it for to try and let's say everybody on this call wanted to, I don't know, engage in an investment venture, but we didn't want to have traditional liability associated with making the decisions. We wanted things to be voted on via cryptocurrency, and we also wanted to interact with other automatically, taking in potential investors, let's say. See, you can see how this is already like running into all sorts of legal issues, right?
Yeah.
Um, but we wanted to take in, potential other investors in an automatic fashion, and you could structure the functionality of the purpose of the corporation into a smart contract. And then, in a sense, it's kind of um, a much more hands off approach to this. Now, these things get really messy because a lot of the governance issues can't work through all of the problems in code. And so what happens in practice is there's kind of forums, which take the actual shape of literal internet forums, where participants in the DAO kind of sit there and argue over governance proposals as to what sort of decisions should be taken with respect to the DAO itself. So if you want to see an extremely ridiculous example of this that just happened in the last couple of days, look up something called Bonk. And Bonk was, I think, a meme coin that was governed by a DAO. And it had been around for, I think, like 2 years. And what happened is that, according to the governance procedures encoded in the smart contract, if you had a certain threshold of the outstanding bonk, you could vote over certain proposals of what to do with the treasury that the DAO controlled. So somebody figured out, well, if I buy $4 million worth of bonk, I can then vote enough votes to send the treasury to myself. So they went through the proper channels and they said, here's the governance proposal. I'm going to vote. I'm going to send all the treasury to myself. And the reality is the community had such low activity of participants who were not paying attention that this person was able to then vote to send all 20 million of the treasury to themselves. And nobody realized until the $20 million transaction occurred. And now people are up in arms and they're reaching out to lawyers. And I'm sure the individual that did this, or group of individuals, looked at the rules of, hey, this is how this network works. We've identified a loophole, and they feel like they profited in an appropriate manner.
Modern day Nigerian prince.
So, uh, in terms of more kind of practical use cases, when we talk about things like chain of custody, et cetera, this is another way to handle provenance issues, right? And deal with records. But again, since these are unforgiving systems, if you get garbage into the system, you're going to have garbage forever. It's like the old problem with computing from Charles Babbage: garbage in, garbage out. And here you can't. Once a transaction is deep enough into a blockchain, you can't go back and change it, which is why the history matters. An audit trail of all the transactions, the sequencing of them. But reliance, kind of asking earlier about DAOs, George, and kind of whether they're recognized in particular jurisdictions. And there's a couple other jurisdictions besides just Wyoming. Who actually is going to treat these records as authoritative? And now, we do have a growing body of case law, depending on your practice area, of judges having to deal with these things in disputes, and people having to produce evidence based off of blockchain records to try and make the legal point, whatever is in dispute, right? One of the best, maybe my favorite blockchain related law in the US is out of Vermont, where the very first thing they passed there in 2017, 2018 was a law that tried to make clear to judges and litigators in Vermont that, hey, this evidence on a blockchain that meets these particular criteria is valid evidence that can be presented in court. So just kind of, when we're talking about, what do we use these things for? What can you do with it? That's where all the legal issues lie, right? Payments, custody, evidence, records, transactions, governance, but practically it's kind of what is the legal system really going to recognize or enforce? In my practice, the clients that I deal with, they're trying to do basic things with a technology that's not really purpose built to exist in the current kind of economic environment. So something is like a terms of service can get extremely complicated because you kind of have to get into, well, what is it exactly actually do, and how is that different from kind of consumer expectations, right? Um, there's just a couple of myths versus reality. You know, a lot of people, oh, smart contracts and code will replace law. That's not really true at all. Code is creating new facts for law to interpret. You know, blockchain is anonymous. Not true at all. It's pseudo-anonymous at best and very traceable. In fact, law enforcement loves cryptocurrency. It is an absolute boon to law enforcement because it's a public ledger. All of the transactions are public. Um, so they can just follow along the hops of all the criminal activity. Um, look up a famous case involving the Dread Pirate Roberts and Pirate Bay, and how they found Pirate Bay was basically like illegal eBay, right? And they found CEO of it through tracing cryptocurrency transactions. They found him in the public library in San Francisco with his laptop open and apprehended him there, all because they were able to trace all the transactions, right?
I got a
That
story
was,
to tell you. Uh, I got a phone call from somebody who was working for a company in Ohio, uh, and the SEC came in and shut the company down. They were one of these like an ATM machine for cryptos. People
mm,
would put cash into the machine and get a crypto coin, a Bitcoin or whatever they were. And it actually was nothing but a big money laundering operation for drug money. So because the drug runners would take their cash, go to these machines, deposit them in to the machine, and basically legitimize their money through
mhm.
those crypto ATM machines.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Um, yeah, another myth is, there's no intermediary, and this speaks to your point. So there's no liability. Not true. Not true at all. Liability is with the developers, the operators, the promoters, the custodians, or even the users themselves. Um, but lawyers are very well positioned for all of this, right? We have to translate technical facts into legal meaning all the time. We have to figure out how to allocate the risks, the duties, the remedies, and we have to advise companies on governance of these networks, compliance with existing laws, disputes, how all this stuff should be handled. And the issue spotting is very similar to any other dispute or any other company trying to come to market, right? Who are the actual actors here? What is the asset? What is the activity going on? Who controls keys? What promises were made? Where are the parties' users located? What evidence is produced? And what can go wrong? A lot. Um, so, not every matter is crypto matter, um, but every area of law is kind of touched by crypto now in some capacity. Really, family law was maybe the first with divorce proceedings, uh, tax as well. The IRS, I think, published guidance back in 2014 because, of course, death and taxes. Um, so yeah, just kind of the common risks here: fraud, scams, marketing claims, affinity fraud, something called rug pulls. This is where a network, when George Coin comes live and he has got us all as, early investors, etc. And then he just takes all of our money and the network goes away. He's pulled the rug out from under us and he's then off in, I don't know, where would you go, George? Cayman, or you more of a Virgin Islands guy?
Yeah, right.
Issues with around custody and loss of your keys, things getting hacked, a DAO going insolvent or one of these companies going, regulatory concerns. This is where most of the highest value legal activity has been related to securities law, commodities, money transmission, anti-money laundering. There's a lot of actually interesting national security issues raised by these networks, believe it or not. And then tax reporting, and just basic, kind of nuts and bolts tech company issues, right? I mean, at my firm, we handle all sorts of commercial contracts, intellectual property matters, privacy matters. All these companies deal with this stuff. And, proponents of the industry try and tout like, oh, there's less risk because of X, Y, and Z. Risk is like water. It just goes wherever there's space, right? The risk never leaves. Here in Illinois, there's kind of two major things. The big law is, and we dealt with this over the past 3 years with the Illinois Blockchain Association, DACPA, the Digital Asset Consumer Protection Act, which is a licensing scheme that's going in place to try and set up a regime for companies that operate in Illinois that have to meet certain kind of barriers to protect consumers and citizens of the state. Recently, just passed the Illinois Digital Asset Tax Act, which is 0.2% tax on digital asset transactions handled by brokers. It goes into effect January 1. And there's also a bill called the Digital Asset Kiosk Act, which is less interesting and kind of straightforward, I think, but I didn't include it in here. But really, there's kind of five, points here. Blockchain is fundamentally a trust technology. It's really all started with Bitcoin and digital scarcity. It's activity-specific analysis. Keys and custody are kind of the linchpins of playing these spaces, and the regulatory environment is still being shaped. So that's all I have for you today. I mean, I used to teach a 14-week class on this. That was 2 credits, which we always had about 45 to 50 students for. So, I mean, I've taught a lot of people about this stuff over the years. So you can go deep into all this, every single specific point, and really nerd out if that's your thing. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Before we get to questions, stop sharing.
Okay. Stop sharing. Oh, hold on. That's on my third screen over here. Okay. Good?
Yep. And then let me close it out. Okay. So our next session is going to be August 12th. We're going to talk about how AI is transforming evidence and litigation. And if you want CLE credit, send an email to the NWSBA at this address, attendance@nwsba.org. Just say thank you, and you'll get CLE credit. Make sure you write this down.